and that we can solve this by the time
No, I think the microphone doesn't have this.
It's her turn. Yeah, welcome to all of you to our session, a second part of our session on struggles for just energy futures. We'll have 4 talks, and we organized it as such as that the presenters speak for 15 minutes and then is followed by a 15 minutes discussion. And we'll ask you actually to write down your questions in the chat so that we can collect it and then pose it to the speaker after the presentation. For us, it's better actually, or we decided to have the questions in the chat so that you can also refer to each other while writing down questions or like giving discussion input or whatever you like. Because if you do it in the Q&A section, it's only the speakers who can see it. And if you do it in the chat, then it's for the audience to see. The other thing we would want to inform you is that we're recording the session. So we checked with the speakers and it's all okay for the speakers, but for you audience to know that the session will be recorded so that other people can see it afterwards. It will then be uploaded to the website of the Energy Transition Forschungsverbund. Yeah, I guess that's all the technical things from my side, and we're happy to start with Rebecca Grant, who's giving us insights into struggles for just energy futures in Malawi. The floor is yours, Rebecca.
Hi, everyone. It's really lovely to be here today, and thank you for coming to this talk. My name is Rebecca Grant. I'm a second-year PhD student at the University of Edinburgh. My PhD research looks at the energy injustices associated with off-grid solar PV use in Rwanda. However, my talk today focuses on moving beyond the single system, expanding notions of energy justice for landscapes undergoing electrification. This builds on research conducted in Malawi in March and June of 2019, which examined energy infrastructural decision-making in the country. And the result presented was collected in collaboration with the University of Malawi in Zomba, and also with colleagues from the University of St. Andrews. A significant recognition of the need of the essentiality of electricity access to the attainment of other human rights, and most visibly in Sustainable Development Goal 7, which calls for both decarbonisation of the electricity sector whilst advocating for universal electrification. Whilst progress is being made in many regions of the world with electricity access increasing, progress towards Sustainable Development Goal 7 in Malawi remains low, with electricity access just 13% of the total population and 41% of the urban population, and only 4% of the rural population have access to electricity. Several factors contribute to this, including an over-reliance on hydroelectricity with 350 megawatts of 372 megawatts of electricity generation powered through hydroelectricity. Exacerbating this energy vulnerability, most hydroelectricity schemes are located on one central river, the Shiri River, which is itself very vulnerable to, and increasingly vulnerable with climate change, to drought and flash flooding. This contributes to a supply deficit with frequent periods of load shedding, and challenges associated with electrification are also compounded by inefficient existing infrastructures and a national grid which is lacking in many regions of the country, and especially in rural regions. The use of biomass then for cooking, heating and lighting is widespread, and especially in rural regions, despite this evidence of the adverse health impacts of burning biomass, for example, through air pollution. The 2018 Malawi National Energy Policy, however, has outlined ambitions for 30% electrification by 2030, with a recognition of the need to reduce reliance on biomass and to increase generation through renewable energies. With population growth continuously superseding electrification rate, though, attempts to meet this electrification target will be especially challenging. It is imperative, however, that the population of Malawi do gain access to safe, reliable and affordable energy, and this has triggered discussions within and between national and international actors on how best to increase electrification rate where it has historically been so low. So these discussions need to consider how, in context of low electricity access, such as in Malawi, the transition from biomass to electrification can be both a driver and a source of injustice. Analysis of injustices which have emerged from energy systems have often been siloed, focusing on single energy systems, for example, hydroelectricity or biomass or nuclear or coal. And this has obscured key concerns which emerge where multiple systems of energy generation exist simultaneously in the same spaces, such as in rural Malawi, and where these systems have differentiated impacts within affected communities. I speak of injustices and I refer to the energy justice framework here. The energy justice framework offers a way to identify and discuss injustices which emerge with an energy transition through the application of a rights-based perspective at every stage of the supply chain. The energy justice framework is just one conceptualization or one framework to understand and recognize injustice. There are others, but it's the one I'll draw on today. This framework highlights the necessity of recognizing all of those who are impacted by energy decisions or by energy supply chains, justice with recognition, enabling and supporting appropriate mechanisms for the inclusion of those affected in decision making, procedural justice, and identifying how risks and benefits of energy decisions and energy system use are distributed spatially and temporally across populations, so-called distributional justice. The energy justice framework seeks to understand how energy systems from generation and transmission to consumption and waste can manifest as sources of injustice over space and time. As I mentioned, the drive for low carbon electrification, especially in settings where biomass use for cooking is widespread, may act as a driver of new and intersecting injustices. The energy justice framework is well posited to recognise injustices which emerge across energy supply chains, though, as previously mentioned, existing analysis is typically focused on single energy systems. But in order to capture injustices emerging in settings of dual biomass use and hydroelectricity generation, it is necessary to consider how energy systems impact on both human health, for example, through air pollution, but also on the functionality of ecosystems through deforestation and siltation of rivers, which impacts energy generation in turn. Building on this, we asked the following research questions, seeking to understand the risks emerging from lack of or inequitable energy and electricity access in Malawi. And these risks are understood as being energy injustices. We adopted a qualitative approach to our research, seeking to understand the energy landscape and challenges in Malawi from the perspective of different stakeholders. In total, we conducted 33 interviews, 25 of these with so-called elite stakeholders, those involved in energy policy, planning and generation in Malawi, and these including government, non-governmental and private sector organisations. We also carried out 8 interviews with rural energy users of a hydroelectricity mini-grid in the south of the country in a rural region. And this was to better understand the energy injustices which emerge in communities using both electricity and biomass use. Building on my subsequent, with the results I'll now present, I'll argue that we need to expand notions of energy justice beyond the single energy system and to include human and ecosystem health as interconnected. So we identified a set of recognition injustices relating to the representation and recognition of certain communities in energy planning and use in Malawi. So these included challenges with representation and discussion of rural energy users by some non-governmental and government organisations. These could be understood as potentially reductive and patronising, understanding energy users either as undeserving of electricity, for example, through quotes like, "These people have lived for hundreds of years without electricity, why bother now?" As ignorant of the impacts of biomass use and lack of electricity access on health and that of the environment. When people are in survival mode, you don't think about the environment, was another quote. Or conceptualized solely in economic terms. For example, rural energy users are a small market. They're not big enough to be of interest to developers. Where current ability to pay defines identity of existing rural energy users, but if sections of the population are only ever conceptualized according to their present inability to pay, there'll never be a transition to countrywide electrification for rural energy users. We also identified a set of, and linked to recognition injustices, procedural injustices, which emerged through discussions surrounding government policy and electrification planning in Malawi. There was evidence that these slowed or hindered access to electricity and cost effectiveness of electrification in the country. So these barriers relate to government policy, which was described as being inefficient in some cases or inconsistent, and in some specific cases contradictory as well. For example, government policy, will it be consistent going forward? There was consistent themes brought up in interviews of uncertainty surrounding energy policy, and particularly the management of independent power producers, and whether international and national power producers would be supported by the government. There were also concerns raised about the management of the historically state-owned ESCOM, which is in charge of power transmission and distribution, and Agenco, which has responsibilities for generation, with some highlighting potentially inefficient spending in these organisations, which hindered progress towards electrification. There was also perceived preferencing by some for ESCOM and Agenco, which meant that independent power producers were sometimes reluctant to engage in the Malawian energy sector, but this was also compounded by perceptions of this being a risky financial environment to invest in, where returns were not necessarily guaranteed. And finally, in discussions with users of an off-grid hydroelectricity system, one of the procedural injustices we encountered was it's actually very challenging to get wired to the mini grid. So despite there being an electricity system in place, this process involved applications to the off-grid hydroelectricity company itself, which required being able to write and read, being able to hire an engineer to certify your home for connection to the grid, and also having a home that was suitable for a grid connection, so not a fire risk. These seem, I guess, very, very simple, but they did hinder access to electricity, even in communities which, in theory, had access to electricity. A set of inequalities also emerged in being able to access electricity in Malawi, or where people were based, impacting on how and when people access electricity. One interviewee described a situation where over 80% of the population were living within 5 kilometers of an existing grid, though electricity access and connection to the grid continues to remain exceptionally low. The 80% on the periphery of grid systems are disadvantaged in being proximate to grids without having access to the benefits of electrification. They are, to quote Buzarowski and Simcock, arbitrarily disadvantaged in their ability to attain essential energy services through location. Many grids, provided primarily to meet rural energy needs, were also described as being donor-driven, and as such, in some cases, were randomly allocated around Malawi, with connection to electricity then being almost a lottery in areas where the national grid does not extend, and where mini grids, in theory, could act to infill access needs, there are those who are disadvantaged by not being recognised as a candidate potentially for donor-driven electrification, and by being distant from the national grid. And so the voices of these excluded populations is maybe not heard in existing policies, or by a focus on electrification, which is donor-driven, off-grid, or government-managed national grid. I don't think this would be isolated to Malawi. In Rwanda, off-grid systems are suggested as being able to provide electrification for rural energy users through a private sector-driven approach, but I imagine some of the similar challenges of when people access electricity and how, and the criteria for that will apply across a range of settings. Even with a push to expand on-grid connection, which is also the ultimate aim in Rwanda as in Malawi, rural populations will still be disadvantaged, again, through their conceptualization as a small market. And one NGO described them as being the last to benefit from electrification planning, which focuses very specifically on on-grid solutions. Increasingly, there have also been calls to integrate non-human actors into energy justice frameworks, and scope remains to further connect ecosystem functionality with human health and energy justice. Human health, which I define here as both physical...
You have 2 minutes to go.
Thank you. Physical and Mental well-being is affected by energy generation and use. Ecosystem health, defined as ecosystem functionality and capability to provide for human needs, is also impacted on and impacted by energy system. A just transition demands the full inclusion and recognition of the adverse impacts of energy systems where compromises to health are symptomatic of recognition procedural and recognition injustices. So very briefly, we identified the burning of biomass for cooking, heating and lighting was identified throughout interviews as a determinant of ill health, with it described as causing airborne diseases and impacting the lives of consumers, particularly in households with poor ventilation. The process of collecting biomass from protected forests was also a threat to health, and with deforestation illegal in many protected forests to combat as a conservation attempt, those who collect firewood, which were almost always women, were described as being vulnerable to sexual assault or rape from those guarding the forests. And one interview described guards who asked for terrible things from women, sexual favours. We also see that the transition from biomass to electricity is not linear in a low-income context such as Malawi, and distributional injustices can be overlooked where energy access at a local scale and national scale is not understood through the prism of intersecting human and ecosystem health. For example, deforestation and resulting siltation of hydroelectricity systems in Malawi limit electricity generation capabilities of the facilities at both a mini-grid level and a national grid level, and restricting electricity access for both locally proximate and distant grid-connected groups. And finally, a very quick summary. Placing ecosystem and health issues within the energy justice framework allows for a holistic approach that shifts from the conventional depiction of human health and ecosystem health as separate and unconnected. The value of this integrated approach is exemplified when considering, I guess, energy provision and the role of women in rural Malawian society or in society. In both rural and peri-urban settings, the collection of firewood and cooking with firewood is linked to various health hazards previously mentioned. These injustices, which are disproportionately experienced by women and children, are further embedded by a lack of inclusion in financial decision-making in some instances, especially regarding energy source and use of energy, with biomass free in many contexts. And also, electricity is not often used to cook in a wide variety of settings and produces a different type of food and flavour, which is why even in communities that were connected to electricity, biomass use continued and biomass burning continued. It's necessary to understand this according to the energy justice framework as both a recognition justice and a procedural injustice, whilst capturing biomass use as a threat to both ecosystem and human health. Injustices at this household level must be understood and attempts made to alleviate them, to improve both the health of the population directly and to improve ecosystem functionality with indirect positive impacts for the future health of current and future generations. Overall, I hope that, or one of my central thesis or points is that we do need to extend research beyond the single energy system, given that the transition from biomass to electricity use is not linear. I also argue that ecosystem functionality and human health are linked, that research should seek to better understand these as energy injustices. And finally, echoing Boma and Roth's group, it's necessary to consider energy needs and visions in the transition to electrification, and particularly how different energy sources are used and required, and the meanings of these, and what people's aspirations and needs for energy uses are. Thank you very much for listening to my talk. Does anyone have any questions?
Thanks a lot, Rebecca. Everybody is welcome to type questions in the chat on the right hand side. I just read out the first question, which is whether you have spoken to private sector companies and what they experience or how they experience the present dynamics you described. That's the first question.
So yes, we did speak to. We spoke to the owner of the hydroelectricity mini-grid, which was a social enterprise, as well as a couple of independent power producers in Malawi. They spoke of a changing environment, but one which had a policy environment which had historically been very hard for independent power producers to come into, with a lot of confusing legislation, lack of government support for independent power producers or for international or national power producers, and a kind of quite arbitrary process of being able to of obtaining a license to be able to sell power in Malawi. But there was discussions as we were leaving, and I think it has now changed in 2020, of an increasingly welcoming environment to investors, and a recognition by the Malawian government that in order to achieve its electrification aims, need to be a coordinated state and private sector driven approach to producing power.
Okay, there are more questions coming in regarding the concept of energy justice.
Mm-hmm.
The first question is that you described the deployment of the mini-grid as a lottery, and if you think the framework of energy justice could help decision makers to identify a more just way to allocate resources, and for example, comparing approaches like needs-based or impact-based. That's the first question. I give you 3 in total. The second is why you talk about risks and not conflicts. This refers to your research question.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you use risk as a concept, then this is a remark, you should have to combine it better with your energy justice framework. Maybe you can respond to this. And the last question is why you had the slide with the 3 dimensions of energy justice, and then there's a question why you did not expand this. So Wakul actually used 10 aspects of energy justice, and why you don't include, for example, intergenerational justice. So why do you use the framework the way you use? This is the main question. So I hope you can ask these 3 questions.
Great question. I'll go, refer to the first one. I do think the energy justice framework has a lot of utility in its 3 questions it asks, which I'll go back to that slide here, in asking where are injustices, who is ignored, and is there fair process. And I think that should be applied to not just mini-grid deployment, but all energy systems or future energy planning. I think that's a really valuable set of questions, so that we ensure that the energy systems work for people, that they are affected, and that there's also the adequate inclusion of affected stakeholders early on in decision making. I think from my research in Rwanda, but also the research in Malawi, there's emerging challenges around needs and whether off-grid systems, for example, off-grid solar PV, meet the needs of those they're intended to benefit, with a lot of people describing, especially in the case of off-grid solar PV, these systems as second class, as unable to fulfill energy generation wants, or unable to let people fulfill their aspirations for using energy, for example, in income generation. So I would argue for a more needs-based approach, on asking affected stakeholders or affected beneficiaries early on in the process about what energy visions and aspirations are of energy systems, to ensure that energy systems can meet these needs at once. But that is a great question, and one which I'm sure I don't have the kind of full capacity to answer fully. But I do think in cases of mini grids, it would be especially helpful, or with off-grid solutions, given that these tend to be limited generation. The second question, talking about risks and not conflicts. I talked about risks and benefits here primarily because it was a language we used in interviews to ask different stakeholders about questions of justice. Justice itself is an incredibly normative term, and we chose not to use these in interviews, given lots of preconceptions about what this means that are not necessarily evident. So risks and benefits, whilst not neutral, were sometimes more easily understood, or could help us to communicate with a range of stakeholders in a way that was not potentially too academic or too making too many normative assumptions. And that's a very helpful comment, especially about integrating it better into the energy justice framework. So thank you for that. But we primarily used risks and benefits because it was a language that we used in interviews to ask stakeholders about what was happening in Malawi. I use the 3 tenets framework because I think it's a quite not simple conceptualization, but I think it breaks down the 3 elements of injustice quite well, and the questions, the evaluative and normative dimensions, work well for being broad enough to, I think, capture injustice. I am familiar with Sovacool's 10 aspects of energy justice and also inter and intra-generational justice, and equally important considerations. And I think hopefully the energy justice framework applied in this talk would consider also distributional injustices, not just in the present but in the future too. So incorporating this intergenerational and intra-generational justice dimension as well, whilst not explicitly.
Okay, thanks, Rebecca, for your precise answers. I don't see any more questions in the chat. So I think we just move on, right, Eva?
Yeah, then we move on to... Thank you very much, Rebecca, for the nice talk, and also for talking about energy justice. I guess it's rather new concept, is something we can discuss for ages on. As people already started in the chat. And a short reminder to you all, you can, after the talk, after we kicked you back into the lobby, you can have chats and video chats in private or in small groups. So if you feel like discussing more on certain issues, just invite other speakers or other attendees into a private chat, and you can have your own small coffee break group. Now we're happy to hear Nora, and she's taking us to Latin America and the struggles for just energy futures there. There she is, and we're looking forward to listen to your presentation, and we're especially happy to see and hear you.
After some difficulties with my laptop. Okay, welcome everyone, and I also wanted to thank everyone for organizing the conference. I think that all the sessions and speakers are really interesting, and I can't wait to hear them. And what I would like to contribute is a perspective of a political scientist that is trying to improve the processes by which energy justice is being streamed into policies, and to some extent, of course, change ethical considerations and policy frameworks in energy policies. So let me just go to my presentation. I have many slides, but I will go through them rather quickly. And when I'm finished, please don't hesitate to ask. I'll go back to whatever needs to be explained. So sorry, I need to go to my first slide. Okay, so my research interests intersect development, energy systems, technology assessments, coordination of sustainable development goals, with focus on energy, sustainable development goal number 7, thinking about action-oriented policy research, and actually what are the categories, meanings, definitions that are floating out there across different policy frameworks, academia, policy practice, and so on. We really do need to focus on the meanings and not misinterpret or replicate wrong categories, thinking we're talking about the same thing. So yeah, speaking the same language, which also applies to issues of cross-disciplinarity. Then also my research interests are within the human and indigenous rights, which by that I mean culturally appropriate development, rural development, small scale development, and energy futures. What if we don't get this right? What will happen? What is likely to happen? So the national context where I'm working in is Central America, country of Panama. If you've been there, I'm sure you're familiar with the incredible infrastructure of the capital city. This is where all the growth and everything is concentrated. The picture on the left shows you Panama Canal as a passage of vessels, right? It's roughly up to 1,500 vessels pass through there. Of course, they run on bunker fuel, which is a absolutely horrific contaminant and pollutant. So obviously, that does not have good impacts on the local communities along the canal. But at the same time, of course, from the national perspective, the government is saying, well, we're saving global emissions because we're allowing for this passage, therefore cutting the journey of the vessels by 5 to 10 days. They mostly go to Asia. So anyway, those are local issues. And the reason I'm saying this is that Panama is an incredible case for really looking at the difference between large-scale technical systems and solutions versus rural comarcas, which I will focus on in the presentation. But you also see the picture on the right. That's Panama City. It looks like Miami. The architecture, there's basically no solar power. So all of these skyscrapers and the new development, you know, air conditioning, escalators, everything is, you know, not run on renewables, which present a great opportunity to transition in the urban setting. So these large technical systems, of course, the question I'm asking is, so what is the source of demand, and can it be met locally, or does it need to be at the expense of rural areas and with high biodiversity and therefore damage and interruption of ecosystems, and so intrusion in areas outside of the city? So these are all the mega development projects that are being planned, and that will, of course, result in an increase in demand. The current energy mix in Panama is, as you see, it's very much based on petroleum derivatives, 67%, and only 2% solar power. Although that's a big improvement, because when I started the research a couple of years ago, it was only 0.5%. This is the same, basically, point I'm trying to make, is that, you know, it's gasoline, ethanol, liquid gas, petroleum, all jet fuels, and so on, that are being used locally. So there is a national energy strategy in place, and of course, it is focusing on rural poverty and bringing in electrification and decarbonization of the energy matrix, efficient use, and so forth. Currently, the situation is such that roughly 70 to 80% of electricity is from renewables with hydroelectric. And there are new projects underway. There is a wind potential, which is underutilized, and solar basically is underdeveloped. So there's a great potential to develop those. How does this fit in with the overall Sustainable Development Network? Well, the way I see it, framework, the way I see it is I see these three goals particularly linked in the national context, which is what source of energy are going to be developed, how are these new infrastructures that I pointed out, what is going to be the energy system that they're going to be running on, and then how will all of this affect the ecosystems in the country. Panama is a country with enormous richness of biodiversity. Now, these concerns that I just presented are not unique to Panama. They're actually unique to Central America and overall Latin America, and I'm sure globally. Now, why are indigenous people, how do they figure in this? Well, 5% of global population occupy 25% of world surface, and they consist of indigenous communities whose land has 80% of remaining biodiversity on the planet. These coincide, overlap with natural resource territories, richness of natural resources in these territories. So what that means is that 5% of the population are stewards of 80% of world's biodiversity. Development projects, therefore, will have to be especially considerate of these local contexts because of the burdens on local systems, provision and regeneration. Now, in Panama, indigenous comarcas have no electricity. Therefore, which infrastructures will be developed in these areas is absolutely key. The history of the comarca I'm looking at, it's Gobi Bugle comarca, which is on the border with Costa Rica, has complicated history in the sense that it actually has been very, very much excluded from national development and sort of forgotten in a way. All the development has happened after arrival of Christopher Columbus, after 1502. Everything happened in the isthmus around the Panama Canal, but not in this remote area. During 19th, 20th century, it was basically indigenous groups were hired to work on the plantations. But other than that, they were not connected with the rest of the country. The first road was built in 1984. And what that means is that there hasn't been much interaction, and the relations between the central government and these and the communities tends to be very strained, and I will explain why. The indigenous status of communities in Panama, actually the protections of indigenous peoples are rather progressive. The first comarca, which is a semi-autonomous territory, dates back to 1938, and then since then 4 other comarcas for different indigenous communities around the country have been established. Okay. Sorry. The law Law 10 of 1997 established Comarca Gobi Bugle, which has its own charter and articles that govern the use of resources, management of resources, and property rights and possessory rights on the comarca. So certain rights are in place. However, the main points are that the state may or may not recognize the authority of indigenous communities over natural resources within the comarca, of course, based on national interest, which overrides local rights. That is the case in most countries. Sorry, okay. The development on the comarca very complicated history. Since 1968, there have been attempts to open up the territory for mining, particularly copper mining. Every single project seems, as far as I know, has been contested by local people because of lack of trust, not clarity of regimes of how basically profits will be distributed, who is responsible for what, and basically lack of information about the projects for the most part. Also, of course, intra-community issues. So there is very little development except hydropower, and those projects have been contested. And so this is a real bad precedent for future cooperation. Okay, I have 2 more minutes. Sorry. I don't know. My PowerPoint is not moving. I'm very, very sorry. Okay. The situation on the comarca is such, I mentioned that there is basically no electricity as of now. So 86 to 90% of population in Panama has access to electricity, but not this particular Gobe community. That access is limited to anywhere between 4 to 8%, and it's really concentrated around places that are close to the existing towns and grids and so forth. All the communities that are 6 or more hours away have no access. Okay, sorry. For cooking, what is used is wood. 85% of the communities use wood, which is different from other indigenous tribes, but it also poses risk for the resources and forest and so on. Now, equity and energy transition. So how do I look at equity on indigenous territories? Well, there's a different way of looking at it. We can look at it as justice, moral philosophy, Amerindian ontology, who decides really what's equitable. In terms of legal protections as justice, as I mentioned, the laws in Panama are rather progressive and they do provide extensive protections. However, the protections of private investment usually override. So if there is a conflict, what happens, unless the project is stopped before it's actually initiated, then the chances that it will be completed are very high. Sorry.
No, 2 more minutes, and then you really have to.
Yes.
Be done.
So these are the different dimensions of justice, forms of justice. They were already discussed in the previous talk. The way I look at it, justice as recognition for indigenous people is absolutely key because it guarantees self-determination, development, and so on. If you don't have recognition, you don't have the others. You don't have procedural or distributive justice. So it's very much important. The future energy pathways, the way I look at it, imperatives for equitable transitions, we need to move in indigenous territories from inequitable to equitable framework, which really means shifting from exclusion, marginalization to inclusion, participation in all phases of planning, including post-assessment, which is very important. Instead of land capture, whether it is for hydroelectric development or other forms of energy, to common pool resources, so more energy cooperatives, that would be something that's more appropriate, culturally appropriate. And from intrusion in territories to alternatives, self-initiated projects on the comarca, that is combined with developments of skills and capabilities. Of course, we don't want to reproduce structural inequities and rather consider from indigenous perspectives what should we be concerned about and responsible for, right? Because it's Western versus indigenous worldviews. And the real risk of not considering, not following cultural protocols is actually the erasure of the culture itself, because if the people are pushed out of their comarcas, they need to live in rural areas, which is what we're seeing, out migration, that basically makes it impossible for them to retain their culture, connection to the land, agricultural practices, and so on. So what is necessary is, of course, consider in energy pathways what is culturally appropriate in addition to what's socially acceptable. There are political risks. Digital wars, electoral cycles, presence of political parties that are polarizing the indigenous communities one against the other. And of course, weak democracies, like how do we ensure equity in energy transitions if we don't have strong democracies? That's almost impossible. So what I recommend, that's the last point I'm going to make, is that, of course, energy justice in indigenous contexts need to consider multi-level perspective. And in cases, we are always dealing with small-scale energy systems, right? So even though capital cities have needs for large-scale technical systems, it doesn't mean it needs to be at the cost. We should still look for small-scale solutions. And of course, there needs to be a lot of transdisciplinary work between the academics, research communities that include local indigenous communities. So that will be it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Nora.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, everybody is invited to type questions in the chat, and I start with one myself. I was just wondering, how is the political dimension in the community or communities you described? How are political claims articulated, or is there a kind of organization, or is there a way of trying to get more impact? Maybe you can elaborate a bit on this.
Yes, there is the local communities. The problem is the distance between the communities. So basically they do meet, but they're local, regional, caciques and so on. And there's a general congress which constitutes the traditional political power. But they don't meet very often. So a lot of issues are arising and the communities act on their own in a way. And there also the representation that's at the national level doesn't always represent the traditional authorities or the views of the people at the of the communities, because there is not enough communication, there's not enough information sharing, or so for a lot of the communities are linking with NGOs that help them articulate their claims and oppose development and so on. But what I maybe didn't stress enough is that from my experience and my interaction, the Gobes, because of their remoteness, have very different political power than, for example, Gunas, which is another tribe, much smaller tribe, but that lives in proximity that has more access to the central sort of political power. So the Gobi concerns are more, marginalized in this way because they don't have this way of articulating what they, their preferences and so on. But I think the focus should be in this specific case on capabilities. So building capabilities, not just to communicate messages, but basically to formulate visions of future. What do they want? What type of rural development they want? Because, even the extra local, let's say, science communities, conservationists who are working with the local community, they can't do everything in terms of, like imposing their Western worldviews on the local culture, right? So it has to be the local people that form these visions, and that, that has to be informed in turn by capabilities, right? Because right now there are no schools. I mean, there are minimal amount of schools, and they're out of access to many communities. They're not within access. There are no hospitals there. So, but the capabilities is the key to get to the next step, which is to determine what future they want, which in turn should determine what energy systems they need.
There's a question.
Yeah.
Okay. There's a question from Rebecca, and she asked, she's interested in the dimension of recognition, and she asked whether there's a misrecognition of certain members of communities or within communities in high-level discussions with energy companies or the government. Yes,
but those are the issues that are being contested within the communities themselves, because, like, for example, some of the support for the hydroelectric projects in the past, some communities, of course, support it and can secure, let's say, more benefits. So those would be supportive of it, but others don't. So there is no really consensus on the local level, unfortunately, right? And that's why I'm saying, if working together and working out a structure, let's say they have schools, training centers, where these communities get together and sort of jointly discuss these issues, rather than being approached in isolation by political representative or energy company people and so forth. There needs to be some sort of a unified political platform. And that, as I said, that only happens during the General Congress, which meets only once a year, I believe, yeah. So, so the communication between the communities is really the key to get to the level of high-level discussions, so that they have agreement before they communicate with the energy companies or the government.
Then there's a question: how would you change large-scale development projects to safeguard the SDGs you outlined? And maybe one can add, because I think you promoted small-scale development. I would maybe add the question: or do you think this is not possible at all? Maybe put it that way.
Well, large-scale development, absolutely. You can, for large-scale development. I mean, I pointed out what we have in Panama is the canal, and you have the city, which is not run on solar. I think that can be changed. I think the canal zone can be changed into you basically use different fuel for the ships, and that's going to have enormous impact. So that and of course solar infrastructure for the city, and that means changing building codes, architecture, and so on. Because in fact, there was a law against solar panels in the city until recently. So that changed, but you still don't have it. You only have 2% of solar power in a country that has extremely high solar potential. And it's kind of ironic because it's a, you know, as I said, it's like Miami. It's an extremely advanced, technically advanced country. So, the potential to I think to do the transition is there. There is a technical university that I think that's focusing now on energy and renewables, and so it's sometimes a race against time, right? Because how is the market going to be developed? Are they going to dump natural gas infrastructures there, or are the solar people going to make it first? You know, and so contestation, of course, is very important because the groups can at least slow down this pace of streaming of, let's say, fossil fuel infrastructures. So that's the one benefit. But at the same time, they have to develop capabilities for the solar, or renewable systems. And oftentimes this doesn't happen in parallel. You have one or the other. You have like, oh, okay, we got fossil fuels. All right, now we're stuck next 20 years. So it is race against time, and the temporal dimension is very.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Nora. We move on to the next presentation.
All right. Thank you.
Oh, is the camera? Oh, do you hear me? Yeah, we're happy to have Majd Jayouzi with us. Majd, I'd be also happy if you just tell me how to pronounce your name correctly, because I did it all wrong, probably.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah, great.
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. Yeah, Majd. Yeah, it's close enough. You can pronounce it as Majd.
Yeah, thanks enough. You can do it while introducing yourself with 2 sentences. Now she's talking on. She's taking us to Kenya, and she's talking on electricity infrastructures, and we're happy to hear you talk. And when the time's up, I'll give you that sign. So I hope you see me. In this,
yeah. Okay.
Fantastic. Go ahead.
So yeah, hello everybody. My name is Majd Jayouzi, and I'm doing my PhD in human geography at the University of Manchester, and I'm interested in the idea of just transitions and electricity infrastructures in Kenya. Basically, the context of my research is the electrification transitions or electricity transitions that's happening in Kenya, and so Kenya is really electrifying very fast and aims to achieve universal electrification by 2022. So the purpose of my presentation today is to shed the light on transformations in the socio-technical electricity landscapes and explore the implications on achieving a just transition in Kenya. I use my consumption framework uses concepts from just transitions, energy landscapes, and heterogeneous infrastructures. And I used basically, I based my findings on qualitative interviews with policymakers, with private people from the private sector, from NGOs, from energy consultants, etc. Key stakeholders in the sector, and in addition to document review. I'm just to say that I'm just doing, this is not my final findings. This is basically a preliminary analysis. So I'm not drawing any conclusions here. I'm just hoping maybe with the discussion. So I'll just talk about my conceptual framework a bit. My idea or my conceptualization of a just energy transition is concerned with the idea of how a country could achieve a sustainable energy transition while promoting economic development and alleviating poverty or achieving human well-being. Because I think that discussions about sustainable energy transitions in the Global South need to include questions about development processes and their complex relationship with sustainability transitions. So I actually follow the suit of Swilling et al. in conceptualizing a just transition as a structural transformation that results in the achievements of two linked goals: developmental welfarism and sustainable transition. So these basically need structural transformations for them to happen. So basically, I'm looking at a just development-oriented transition that can achieve development in the country and also promote human well-being. This is key because a lot of African countries are really keen on industrialization and modernization. So this is a very key aspect, I think, in thinking about just energy transitions. So I also utilize concepts from geography of energy transitions, basically just emphasizing how energy transitions are processes that are constituted geographically and spatially, and how is it essential to uncover uneven development and understand pathways of energy transitions. Sorry, I haven't been clicking on my slides. So also I utilize concept from the literature of infrastructure studies and specifically heterogeneous infrastructures, because energy transition, especially in the Global South, does not it's not necessarily about the transition from the formal to the informal. In many cases, it involves the coexistence of diverse delivery configurations, and this is very important in the context of Kenya because the ideal of the centralized integrated ideal network does not exist as it is in the case of many countries in the Global South. So thinking through heterogeneous and hybrid infrastructures that are characterized by a mix of diverse and multiple configurations of electricity delivery helps us critically assess how a transition can take, it's a just transition can take place within these diverse configurations. Yeah, so so just a bit about Kenya. So Kenya has basically really achieved a lot of progress in terms of its electrification. It was able to increase its electrification from 32% to 75%, and this involved a really significant change in its electricity infrastructure and also electricity systems, and resulted in a very profound shift or transformation in socio-technical landscape in terms of energy, all the activities related to energy production and consumption. Actually, in terms of the sustainability, most of the electricity in the country comes from renewables, especially from geothermal, because the country is endowed, it has one of the top 10 geothermal electricity producers in the world. It also has the largest sub-Saharan wind power projects in the continent, and the largest source project in the East African region. It's also connected by regional connection through the East Africa Power Pool with Uganda, Ethiopia, and the planned connection with Tanzania. So also, as I mentioned before, the electricity infrastructure or electricity systems in Kenya are characterized by heterogeneous configurations. They really, heterogeneous configuration refer to technical and social mix of electricity delivery. So some people access the electricity through the grid, through prepaid meter or the postpaid meters, through informal connections mediated by informal service providers or landlord, off-grid through the pay-go model or solar house systems, mini-grids, or even industrial decentralized systems that power factories. So Kenya also has a very strong off-grid PV market and a private sector that, as one of my interviews mentions, moves despite the government and is a very active in promoting renewables in Kenya. So I'm just going to talk about the institutional policy framework for a bit, just to understand the background. In terms of transformations in the material electricity landscape in Kenya, it has been going on for a few decades. It started with the electricity reforms in 1996, which was under the pressure of the World Bank, which led to basically, as happened with a lot of countries, to the liberalization of the sector and unbundling generation and transmission and generation and distribution. And over the following years, the sector was structured and a lot of institutions were introduced, such as the Energy Regulatory Commission and the Rural Electrification Authority, to govern electricity transitions and electrifications in Kenya. Most significantly lately, the Energy Act 2019 was introduced, where the government basically committed to facilitate the provision of affordable energy services to all persons in Kenya. This is significant in itself because before the government never really framed a provision of affordable energy services as a goal. It was actually before it was energy services at low cost. So actually this denotes a shift in the government let's say commitment to viewing electricity as a basic service that has to be provided to all Kenyans. And also, so Kenya has one of the most advanced, let's say, regulatory environments in the region. And this Energy Act promotes local generation and introduced net metering and wheeling tariffs, which all mean a very positive outlook for the promotion of a sustainable transition in the country. In addition to the feed-in tariff that works in place to attract big renewable energy generation. However, many interviewees highlighted the lack of transparency in processes relating to energy with the government, such as mini grid regulation. That was a very high area with high contestation and high, let's say, tension between the government and the private mini regulators, who are always afraid of, who are always contesting the prices of mini grid tariffs that the government imposes. Also, they are not clear about what happens when the grid comes. Also, there's a lack of clarity of what's happening with the auction systems that are supposed to, for example, replace the IPPAs. I'm just included a couple of quotes here, which one of my interviews said that the Kenyan government is amazing because we have everything on paper but nothing in practice. This was shared by a few interviewees, but a lot of other interviews were saying that it's increasingly actually transparent and maybe improving. So I also want to talk about Kenya Vision 2030, because this vision which envisions Kenya to be a newly industrializing middle-income country by 2030, is one of the biggest drivers of electrification in the country, even more than the desire to to provide universal electricity access. And it describes energy as one of the infrastructure enablers of the vision, and as a foundation for the Big Four agenda, for food security, affordable housing, and manufacturing. Also, the electrification in the country is really, as many of my interviews highlighted, is driven by the political agenda of the Jubilee government, which when it assumed power in 2013, promised electrification by 2020, and laid out plans to increase electrical generation by at least 5,000 megawatts, which was like at least twice the generation capacity as at the time, which was very ambitious, and the government had to halt it because of many issues that I will discuss later. So a lot of interviewees highlighted this politicized nature of this electricity or push for large electrification in the country as, the country, the government needing to show a track record to hit the electrification target. For example, one interview said that that was the target of 5,000 megawatts. It was pretty much a fiction that was not based on any real demand. It was a political device, and this was actually shared by a lot of other interviewees. Okay. So the electricity strategy for electrifications in the country. I'm just going to discuss the strategies for electrification, which was this is a new strategy for electrification launched in 2018, and it envisions electrification as a combination of off-grid, mini-grids, and a grid expansion. What's very unique about this is that the government actually was not a supporter of off-grid at all in the last few years, but this really changed with the push from the donors and when the private sector really proved itself. Especially, however, still you can see how the government still prioritized large infrastructures and grid electricity. However, as you can see from the maps, grid electricity is concentrated in urban centers, where the off-grid or mini-grid is concentrated in remote and rural areas with really high rates unequal distribution of electricity infrastructure for two reasons, because grid infrastructure is usually cheaper and of higher quality than mini-grid infrastructures. So I also wanted to talk about a few electrification initiatives that are aimed to improve quality of electricity and provide affordable electricity, including the lifeline tariffs, which gives reduced tariffs for households that consume less than 100 kilowatts. However, this is a cross-subsidy that basically the middle-income consumer bears. Also, the last mile connectivity project, which aims to connect low-voltage households within 600 meters from transformers. This is held as a big success in electrification in Kenya. However, there's a lot of contestation also around that, with a lot of people contesting who qualifies, seeing that it's unjust in its criteria, and a lot of other stakeholders seeing it as a waste of money, because these consumers in these rural areas already don't consume that much, so it's just an investment that is wasted, that basically the middle income consumer bears. I'm gonna skip the slum electrification initiative for the sake of time. I'm gonna talk about the COSAP project, which is basically also to increase access to modern energy access in marginalized or underserved counties in the country. It focuses on the promotion of a market approach to promote mini-grids and off-grid systems in these counties through incentivizing the private sector to market their product there. What's interesting about this project, while it aims at increasing electricity access, it doesn't protect the consumer or address the affordability of these systems. It just incentivizes private sector to go to these places to basically to just diffuse the market. However, this raises a lot of equity concerns because the project is not concerned by the sustainability of these off-grid systems on the long term. If these people are already able to afford it, because these systems basically it's like a subscription model. It's a pay as you go. So it has a lot of question marks around it about whether it's going to be equitable or actually will be just for the people. I'm going to skip also Kenya Power, which is a big actor in shaping basically electrification in the country. It acts as a monopoly because it's the single largest distributor. Yeah. Should I stop?
Yeah, maybe you come to a conclusion now so that we can have a discussion afterwards.
Yeah. So my conclusion, I'll just talk about my conclusion in terms of sustainability. So sustainable electrification from in the country is mainly driven by availability of resources, cost effectiveness, technological advances, and equal service access to the grid. And while the majority of the country's access comes from renewable energy resources, there's still a political imperative to use fossil fuel, particularly coal, to develop capacity and serve the modernization project. Basically, distributed low carbon electricity generation is opposed and contested by parastatal by the very powerful monopoly, the parastatal electricity distributor, which will have implication on just energy and sustainable energy transitions. And the government has also conflicting policies regarding the sustainability of its energy electrification policies. In terms of in terms of equity, electrification strategies and initiatives are highly spatially differentiated, offer like highly spatially differentiated electricity services, leading to unequal access to electricity. So it depends, the type of electricity that you get basically depends on where you are, your income, your basically geographical location. Electricity tariffs in Kenya are basically expensive, and it's a function of low demand, excess capacity, and diesel generation, all basically caused by bad governance of the energy sector and the drive for excessive large infrastructure projects. While different initiatives basically not all of these affordability is still not well addressed. A lot of these services are not affordable, and a lot of other also areas like refugee settlements and the north are marginalized. So in terms of development, visions of modernity and industrialization in Kenya driven massive electrification in the country. However, the industrial development lagged the development of the electricity infrastructures, which negatively affected basically electricity prices and burdened the country. So this basically development can reproduce inequality and injustice instead of recognizing the other ways that could result in well-being. Also, Kenya is, as a result of this very big drive for big electrification in the country, is and also other infrastructure projects, is at the risk of a debt crisis. And this will have implication on a just transition because it will probably result in using tax money that could go to social welfare, social services instead. So I'll just stop here and leave this slide. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. There are already two questions in the chat, which I read out to you. One is, do grid reliability and affordability become a problem due to the massive expansion of unprofitable connections lately? And what are the user responses to this? This is the first question, and maybe you can keep in mind also a second question, which is regarding the limits of market-based approaches to rural electrification. And the question here is if you have another example in addition to COSAT.
Yeah, so thank you for the first question. So exactly, I skipped a few points due to time, but I was going to mention with the KPLC slide that one of the biggest problem actually with this big drive, so the country, the government really started giving a lot of contracts for power generation project all over the country. So what happened is in the name of modernization and because of development to power all of these industrial projects that never actually came online. So what happened is the country ended up with excess power capacity. So ironically, the country has now excess power supply, and not everybody is connected. But which means that this excess power supply increases the tariffs of the price of electricity, because the government basically has to pay all of these power producers. They call it a charge. Because a power producer still will take money from the government, regardless of whether they produce or not, because they have to pay back their loans. So what happened is that this drive for electrification and drive for electrification for development has actually negatively impacted the prices of electricity in the country. This is compounded by the reliability issues, which actually improved in the last 10 years, but still constitute a major problem in the technical losses that KPLC endures, which also affects the affordability of the tariffs. It's all reflected on what the customer pays at the end of the day. So what are the heterogeneous user responses to this? Do you mean what do I mean by heterogeneous, or what are the user responses to the heterogeneous infrastructures?
I think it's just the user responses, and he's already saying maybe they are not homogeneous. He's just asking about the user responses, I think.
Oh yeah, so the heterogeneous electricity infrastructures, I haven't gone in depth into that, but they actually emerge organically from the users most of the time. So before actually it was recognized as a potential electrification vision for Kenya. Electricity infrastructure in the global south are most of the time heterogeneous, in a way that even if there was a central grid or integrated universal infrastructure grid, there was always an element of heterogeneity that emerges from local practices. For example, illegal tapping into the electricity. For example, using off-grid electricity services from your own. You just buy it and use it, even if you have grid next to you. all of these these practices emerge actually as a response to the failure of the state to provide affordable and reliable electricity. And then as the off-grid market and renewable energy technologies offered became more successful in offering solutions for electrification for remote places, you can see that the government started recognizing these solutions as part of the electrification. However, the narrative is still the narrative is still basically for big infrastructures. With my interviews with a lot of officials, they say this is like this is because it's infeasible to, for example, to extend the grid to remote areas. But in the future, when we can, these solutions are seen, off-grid solutions are seen as, let's say, transit solutions. About the second question, about the market-based approach to rural aurification, to have another other examples to COSAP. So the market-based approaches to electrification in general started with the sector liberalization in 1996, which was also a very coordinated approach by the donors and development partners. They pushed Kenya because there was a lot of losses and inefficiencies in the sector. The liberalization in 1996 virtually transformed the whole sector from a public service or a social service, let's say, to a profit. Let's say a very liberalized neoliberal sector. So even KPLC, which is a parastatal company distributor, still operates on the concept of a profit when providing electricity services for a lot of for everywhere. So I don't have other examples for market-based process for off-grid, but if you go to a lot of the donors or development partners websites, you can see that most of them promote for an enabling environment for private sector. A lot of the donors programs work on financing the private sector, enabling the private sector. So it's a very focused approach on that.
Okay, then there's one, maybe probably last question regarding desired energy futures. And the question is, what do you find particularly encouraging and exciting in the developments you described?
What is actually encouraging is that Kenya is actually doing very well in terms of its electricity mix. It's still considering coal for many considerations. One of them is cost and also providing base load for the country. But what's exciting is that the country is electrifying in a sustainable way. A very positive way is that still, with all the inequalities that are happening, a lot of people accessed electricity. Electricity wasn't available in the country. Like the scale of electrification in the country dramatically improved in just 5 years. So that's really actually inspiring. And I think these projects still offer like a better chance for development in the country, even though that some of them are unnecessary. Yeah.
Okay, thanks a lot. Then we move on again to our last presentation.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And we are happy to listen to Silvia Pergetti talking about solar battery use in the Sundarbans. The floor is yours. And
yes,
you'll be warned.
I am prepared. Thank you, Eva and Timo. And thanks everyone for keep listening. So my name is Silvia and I'm a PhD student in social anthropology. And this presentation is very much an invitation to think with me about my work in progress. So any comments and suggestion is welcome at this stage. Charging and discharging, discharging and charging, now full and then empty, now working and then flat. Wet cell, lead acid solar batteries are essential, yet often overlooked parts of off-grid solar energy infrastructure in the Sundarbans and elsewhere. Constantly oscillating between charge and discharge, batteries dictate the rhythm of an uncertain existence that is resting on fragile arrangements and delicate dependencies. Such dependencies both impose limits and help go beyond them in the very same way as batteries with limited capacity expand the limit of the sun not shining at night. Charging and discharging, now full and then empty, batteries remind us that grand visions for tomorrow cannot afford to ignore the limits of today. If no battery charge lasts forever, what does the energy future of an island in Indian Bengal Delta depend on? This is a picture of the Sundarbans where I carry out my field work, and that's the exact location of my 15 months of stay with users of energy batteries between 2019 and 2020. Even before there were bridges connecting the islands of India's Sundarbans, even before there were roads connecting the villages on such islands, even before there were solar PV modules, there were batteries, and they were traveling. Portable batteries traveling on people's heads, traveling on boats, would help temporarily overcome the disconnection and remoteness that had been produced by political processes of exclusion and marginalization. Introducing a pause between power supply and demand, batteries would be charged on the mainland and then discharged on the islands. When in the 1990s, the government started promoting solar home systems in the Sundarbans, the dependencies spanned by traveling batteries became increasingly localized. Because at that point, batteries owned by poorer families would now travel to the nearby places of wealthier relatives who had been able to procure solar home systems. So the charge-discharge cycle infused new life into a local moral economy of patronage, in that repeatedly asking for charge would bring one into another's sphere of influence. Then, in the 2010s, a wildlife conservation organization with a grand vision for energy autonomy decided to implement DC solar mini-grids in forest-fringe areas of India's Sundarbans. Consisting of electricity distribution networks and solar power generation units, but not of centralized battery banks, DC solar mini-grids had been designed so as to displace the give-and-take economies of traveling batteries. Indeed, had the batteries been procured by the project and centrally located at the site of power generation, people would have depended on the organization for procurement, maintenance, and disposal. Instead, the organization called attention away from the finite temporality and underlying dependencies of charge-discharge cycles to emphasize the endless potential of solar power generation. In a vision for energy democracy, where DC solar mini-grids should be, quote, completely owned, operated, and managed by the community, end quote, there was no space for solar batteries, nor for the dependencies they stand for. Relegated to dark corners of people's houses, batteries stopped traveling. So this paper zooms in on solar batteries as a central yet often disregarded feature of 5 DC solar mini-grids on an island of India's Sundarbans. Although implemented by one particular organization, the DC mini-grids both inspire and are inspired by an Indian-specific vision for energy democracy. At its core, this vision is premised on the principle of autonomy, and we will look into that as part of this presentation. Against such a grand vision, solar batteries are hardly capacious enough to grant an illuminated passage from dusk to dawn, boxes of a few cubic decimeters in volumes, batteries can barely power one night's dream, let alone an energy future. In this paper, I want to recenter our imaginations of energy futures on those bits and pieces that make energy infrastructure tangible. Here, I do not side against solar batteries because of, say, their environmental impact. On the contrary, batteries are useful to think with. For one thing, they invite us to think about the current not as an endless flow, but as a limited charge. And in a similar way, taking solar batteries as analytic, we should see the possibilities open up by specific energy technologies, not as endless and revolutionary, but as limited and incremental, depending for their realization on conditions, collateral changes, and collaborations. Thinking with the limits of batteries ideally help us notice the dependencies that make certain energy futures, any future really, possible. Grand visions for energy futures often ignore such dependencies, and yet it is only by giving dependencies recognition that energy futures can be just. So in the remaining of the paper, I will contrast the vision for energy democracy with the reality of living with batteries in India's Sundarbans. And then I will draw my conclusion from there. In March 2016, 60-odd members of civil society organizations working in India on the related issues of human development and environmental conservation met in Bihar as part of a deliberative platform called Energy Alternatives. On that occasion, they prepared and signed a vision statement where they called, quote, for action to mainstream and prioritize renewable energy to meet all future energy needs. Further adding that the search for solutions should be guided by principles of direct, radical, and ecological democracy in which citizens, including the marginalized, are involved in decision-making, end quote. They called their vision statement Gaia Declaration Towards Energy Democracy. Among the principles on which the declaration is based, autonomy figures most centrally. Again, quoting from the declaration, quote, a search for alternatives is not about retreating into states of scarcity and deprivation, but of having real wealth within the context of sustainability, justice, equity. It is about a society that embodies the ancient notion of Swaraj, autonomy and freedom with responsibility, both individual and collective, end quote. Through a reference to the principle Swaraj, that here is translated as autonomy, but most widely discussed in terms of self-rule, the signatories of the declaration drew from a tradition that dates back well before Gandhi and that makes the movement of energy democracy in India somewhat distinct from other energy democracies. Indeed, it was in terms of Swaraj that the community of India was imagined first by Bengali social reformers and anti-colonial nationalists, then by founding father of the post-colonial nation, most prominently Gandhi. Here, I do not have the space to go further into detail, but I will conclude this section by probing the extent to which autonomy, narrowly conceptualized, is able to grant democratic rights for a marginalized community at the fringe of democratic deliberation. For a start, and you can see it here in the picture, the Gaia Declaration was drafted and signed by higher caste individuals, by higher caste and class individuals, representing civil society organizations that met without the people was energy futures they were imagining. And if you're familiar with India, I mean, in India, village people typically do not sit on plastic chairs. So these are all people who typically sit in office and come from a certain background. An example is in order. Greenpeace India, as one of the signatories of the declaration, has put forward a view of decentralized renewable energy as able to spark a democratic revolution premised on energy independence. Their vision is most clearly illustrated by a YouTube video, whose transcript goes like this, quote, imagine that you have the power to take power from the hands of a few and turn that into people power. Imagine that future where power will no longer be centralized and truly be in the hands of the people, end quote. But whose imaginations are these? Interestingly, the video is shot at night and features almost no people. Incidentally, 40 kilometers north of where the Gaia Declaration was signed, a project by Greenpeace India aimed at sparking that revolution by means of a solar mini-grid had failed to captivate people's imagination. The villagers had responded to the centralized renewable energy by defining it fake, in contrast to the real energy of the grid. What does it take then for energy democracy to be realized? Standing next to the 42 ground-mounted PV modules, Subroto expressed his displeasure at the limited durability of the green plastic mesh fencing that enclosed them. They installed the module and then left, he explained, with they referring to the organization that implemented the DC solar mini-grid of which the modules are part. And then left does not refer to the actual physical act of living, but to the devolution of responsibility for the mini-grids to him and the other system operators. The implementing organization, incidentally one of the signatories of the Gaia Declaration, was keen for the mini-grids to be, quote, completely owned, operated, and managed by the community, as the senior coordinator for energy access repeatedly told me, for this is how you achieve, quote, the democratization of energy generation, end quote. In practice, that meant that the costs of procuring the solar batteries, compensating the system operators for their work, and handling the end of life of electrical equipment were to be borne by the community. They installed the modules and then left. Subroto was right. Those modules stood there enclosed by a rapidly deteriorating fencing as an uncelebrated monument to energy autonomy. Yet autonomy, so narrowly conceptualized, was hard to handle for people of limited means and resources. The crew of the matter seemed to be the question of the batteries. People complained that had the organization procured the batteries, they would have been superior in quality and bigger in capacity, thus better able to meet their needs. Instead, having to purchase them independently, people ended up using second-hand batteries or using no batteries at all. In the hot season, when a small fan would be in use for parts of the day, second-hand batteries would give no more than a few hours of dim lighting in the evening. The older the batteries, the more care they needed. Charge, water, occasionally an expert hand. Yet people felt unable or unwilling to care for something that gave them so little. Uncared for, batteries started giving even less. Disappointed with the mini-grids, people stopped paying Subroto and the other system operators, or making unreasonable demands of them. Eventually, as the mini-grids died, one after the other, useless batteries were disposed of locally, with the battery electrolyte ending up in people's gardens or ponds. Batteries as analytic ask difficult questions. What does autonomy mean for Subroto, a system operator whose work goes unvalued by the organization that hired him in the first place? What does autonomy mean for battery owners who have no means to safely dispose of hazardous waste? More generally, what does autonomy mean for the people of the Sundarbans as a region characterized by historical neglect and political marginalization? The answer batteries give is that there is no autonomy without the recognition of dependency. As batteries come to the light from dark corners where they have been hidden, we realize that they never stop traveling and spinning dependencies. And it is not by ignoring these dependencies and by rejecting people's claims for recognition that a vision for energy democracy can be realized. And I figure I'm on time. I didn't have even the need for the 2 minutes reminder.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, that's probably why I forgot, but I totally trusted you to be on time. Now that actually the clock is ringing. Fantastic.
Okay, everybody's invited to write questions in the chat. Maybe you can, in the meantime, I found it very interesting how you connected your very detailed topic with the big question of the relation between autonomy, responsibility, limitation, dependency. I mean, actually, you are referring to different worldviews or cosmovisions regarding the relationship between nature and society, right? Maybe if you want to, you can elaborate a bit more about what this means for just energy visions, maybe.
Yeah, so obviously dependencies is a very permeable word. I mean, it can take a lot of meanings, right? So in this particular case, I really wanted to draw attention to the fact that this is a community, and these are communities most of the time, who have limited means, and so I wanted to draw attention to the fact that communities with limited means often desire connection to NGOs and to authorities more than they desire actually the connection to the grid or the connection to a solar PV plant. So if an NGO comes in, what they value is not the mini grids that the NGO gives, but is the fact that the NGO comes in and potentially stays there in the long term and provides long-term job opportunities or whatever that is. And so that's the focus of this panel, in the sense that, like, of this paper. So that's the use that I make of the word dependency by emphasizing the ways in which communities desire to be dependent on the organization. But at the same time, you know, we could open it up and also argue that, like, that you cannot think about energy futures without considering all the ways in which different actions are related to one another. So yesterday, for example, when I was listening to Benjamin Sovacool's keynote speech, I found, very interesting the moment where he pointed to the kind of, you know, like you could bracket them as externalities, but the kind of side effects that energy transitions in potentially the global north, the side effects that this energy transition has in other parts, and so they don't come to the fore. So in fact, like the word dependency maybe can refer to all these different things going on.
Okay, there's a question regarding the how the lessons learned could be transferred to the global north. Do you think that this interpretation of energy democracy and lessons learned could also influence some of the autonomy efforts of electrification in the global north?
So I think, you know, when I think originally, actually, my PhD project was going to be a comparative project between Germany and India, then eventually didn't ended up to be like that. But if I had to make a guess, from my experience of living in Germany, the communities who go 100% renewables, say, or that decide to have a shared ownership of a community or of a renewable energy project, they have certain rights. They are able to interact with the legislative authorities in a certain way. They are able to, they basically own their space. The situation is very different from communities who are in the global south. And I talk about the communities that I lived with in the Sundarbans. These are communities who first don't speak English, so they are not able to interact maybe with all NGO people that come in, and they are not aware of what the rules in place are. For example, there is a legislation in India that forces implementing organization to take responsibility for the batteries. And this is partly the reason why the organization decided against disseminating batteries in the first place, because they didn't want to have this responsibility. Now, if this, if the same situation would have happened in the global north, I would have imagined the community being able to socially mobilize against that decision. And in this case, it didn't happen because of the limited knowledge of, like, what is the policy context. So I think that coming back to the question, that like communities in the global north potentially are better placed to realize, energy autonomy in a way that is that has a positive social impact, and at the same time, I think communities realizing renewable energy projects should not ignore what the repercussions might be of those projects in the long term and in different places. So, for instance, do not think of the end of your, after 30 years, the solar modules come to an end, and you could imagine, I don't know, after those 30 years, I will donate those solar modules to the global south. I mean, that would be very much a thing not to do for all sorts of reasons, or at least it should be done in a responsible way. So this is perhaps like the lessons that could be drawn for communities in the global north.
Eva, do you want to pose a question? No? Okay. Maybe I'm just interested in your, because there are no other questions in the chat, I just asked one myself. I'm interested in your fieldwork. Did you really say you were 15 months? That's really a long time. So maybe you could describe a bit what you did, and what I'm interested in. What was the most surprising thing you noticed? Was it really, did you have to change your way of research while you were there?
Yeah, so obviously this was the first time I was actually living in a village for a prolonged period of time. So that comes with all sorts of challenges. The activities that I carried out, so I was staying with a family, and then I would travel to different sites. And my object of research ended up becoming the people who most closely work with energy infrastructure. So we are talking about electricians, as well as like system operators, or basically the technicians that are responsible for grid maintenance. So any person, and especially, I mean, in this context, we are mainly talking about men working with the energy infrastructure. So also that was a factor to take into account, in the sense like how those gender expectations came into playing a role in my research. And I think like right now I am going through my research findings, and the thing that I find most interesting is really like this aspect of care and caring for energy infrastructure, and how much work it takes to care and to keep the energy infrastructure alive. So most of the time I find that NGOs or different project implementers are very much focused on implementation. And so they want to deliver the project, and the focus is like within recovering, like within the first 2 years, to recover the costs of investment. So the focus is very much like on the basically implementation, and then the first couple of years. But actually the things get interesting afterwards, because that's when that's when like the implementing agency most of the time move away, and then who is left caring for this project, and what does that mean? And one of the most surprising things that I found was that actually that caring for energy infrastructure opened up a space for identity creation for men with perhaps like limited possibilities otherwise. So people who could not maybe access education because of limited means, but they had the possibility to, because they understood very well the energy system. So they tinkered with it, they play with it, they manipulated it, they became experts, and that created for them like a new livelihood opportunity that was not there in the first place.
Okay, I don't see any more questions. Maybe all speakers could, for the end, switch on the camera again. So, and you should keep in mind what Eva already wrote in the chat, that when you are kicked out to the lobby, you can start, yeah, how do you call it? You can start video chats with individuals or a small group if you have got further, if you want to discuss further. Can you talk?
Yeah, thank you very much. Sometimes I can, sometimes I can't, but I hope I didn't miss too much of the last discussion. Yeah, thanks from my side too, and I hope to see you somewhere in the lobby or in some of these private.
And our session will continue on Thursday afternoon. We've got the third part of our session. So see you on Thursday and have a good day.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.